On behalf of our team at Town Hall and our friends at the LA Bay Book Company, it's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's virtual presentation of Emma Marris in conversation with Jane C. Hu, part of our science lecture series. On behalf of our team, as we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And we thank you all for tuning in. Tonight is the last night of undoubtedly the most extraordinary season of my 16 years here. I want to thank our staff and especially tonight's team, Josh, who has done so much heavy lifting, producing live streams all year long and for the months that preceded this year, and Candace, who has coordinated all the pre-event logistics and served as such a gracious host, closing out most of our author events over the last 16 months. You'll see her on this broadcast a little later. I also want to thank all of you in attendance for watching throughout the year, and especially all of our members for their unflagging support, your unflagging support of Town Hall. If you share, if you're not a member yet, I should say, and you share in Town Hall's vision of a community animated and inspired by arts, science, and culture, where everyone has a voice, please consider supporting us by becoming a member yourself. We'll take a hiatus this summer, just a couple of months though. Rest assured, it'll be all to the good as we prepare an exciting fall season, mixing both virtual and in-building events. And we're excited, beyond excited, I should say, to welcome you back into the building. There are some new events already posting on our online calendar, but we'll be adding a lot of those over the course of the next couple of months, and you'll really start to see it in August. So check back then and join us in Town Hall as it resumes a new normal in just 2.5 months' time. But back to tonight's event. Tonight's presentation will run around 60 minutes, including Q&A. Questions will be selected from those in the chat field at the bottom of the video player, so please submit yours at any time. You can also text your questions to 206-504-2857, a number that is also noted in the chat. Don't worry. We can't guarantee we'll get to every question. We'll try to get to as many as possible. And if you'd like to view the program with closed captions, please click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Arno Matulski Science Lecture Series is supported by Microsoft, KUOW, the Norcliffe Foundation, the Wyncote Foundation Northwest, and the taxpayers of Washington State. Finally, as many of you know, and as I just mentioned, Town Hall is at heart a member-supported organization, and I want to thank all of our members for making it all possible. Finally, you'll want to dive deeper into tonight's topic. I'm certain of it. And so the best way to do that is to purchase a copy of the book. And the best people to purchase that book for are, of course, LA Bay Book Company, our co-sponsors on this evening's event. There's a link to it, of course. Use that link and buy local, and that way places like LA Bay that have been so important to us for so many years will be sure to continue thriving on the other side of the pandemic. And with all that, Emma Marris is an award-winning journalist whose writing on science and the environment has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, National Geographic, Wired, along with the anthology Best American Science and Nature Writing. Her previous book, 2011's Rambunctious Garden, Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World, was the subject of a TED Talk that's received nearly 1.5 million views. She was also featured on the TED Radio Hour and the series Adam Ruins Everything. Emma grew up here in Seattle and now resides in Oregon. Seattle-based journalist Jane C. Hu focuses on the intersection of science, culture, and technology, and her writing has appeared in publications like Slate, High Country News, Undark, Outside, Wired, Smithsonian, The Atlantic, Science, plenty of others. She's also a regular contributor to Slate's Future Tense and a contributing editor at High Country News. Marris's new book, Wild Souls, Freedom and Flourishing in the Non-Human World, is the subject of this evening's talk, our last of this season. Please join me in welcoming Jane C. Hu and Emma Marris.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Hi, Emma. How are you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
Pretty good. Congrats on your book launch. It came out yesterday. I guess to plug, if you haven't gotten a copy of Wild Souls yet, definitely do so. But I wanted to kick things off just by saying I really enjoyed this book. I think the highest compliment I can give any book is that it made me think while also entertaining me. And I feel like that was definitely the case for this book. I guess for context, I didn't grow up outdoorsy at all, never cared about nature as a kid, was very much what I call an indoor cat. But throughout the book, it was just reminding me of kind of my journey to beginning to care about nature, which really didn't start until I moved out west. but I saw all these little glimpses of things, just default assumptions I used to have, like that humans are somehow separate from nature, or that there's a natural state that used to exist that we've somehow ruined, and so that we're part of that. And I feel like, throughout the book, you've made me question those things and make me think about these things that I've been thinking about over the last decade that I've started caring about nature. And I feel like you so masterfully weave together storytelling and philosophy, which made me wonder, maybe, and this is a good place to start, I think, what led you to write this book? Like, what kinds of things were you thinking about when you embarked on this journey? I mean, you write about your travels in the book, but you also talk a fair amount about philosophy. I'm wondering, was it the philosophical readings that made you start thinking about this first, or your travels?
Great question. Sometimes it's actually hard to retroactively determine where ideas started, because they kind of grow on you in this organic way. But I've been covering conservation for a long time, since around 2005. So following questions about how we're saving nature and what is this thing called nature that we're saving and why are we doing this is something that I've been interested in for a long time. I think I got interested in the philosophy in part because I married a philosopher. My husband is an academic philosopher, and so he, I would say, this paper is so weird. They're trying really hard to make sure that the bison in this restoration project don't have any cattle genes. They seem like really obsessed with the purity of these bison. Like, does this make sense? And then we would talk about it over dinner, and he would sort of give me the philosophical tools to ask questions about, is a pure genome valuable? How can we look at that? So I started doing philosophy with him. And then we moved out to Oregon. We'd been living in the Midwest, even though we're both originally from Seattle. And I walked right into the middle of a wolf reintroduction story. There was a wolf right in Klamath County, where I now live, that had just showed up, about the same time I did. We kind of moved in the same week. So I got really interested in wolves, reintroduced wolves, and how heavily managed they were. I started writing about them as a journalist. I got really blown away by the fact that so many, especially in the early days when there were very few in the state, we had something like 60 wolves back in 2013, and like 10 of them had radio collars on, or 15 of them had GPS collars on. And so we knew where they were all the time, and we had their DNA on file, and they all had names. And if they did something that we didn't like, we could go out there and kill them pretty easily. And I was like, is this really a wild animal anymore? So that kind of kicked off the project. And that was a long time ago. That was 2013 when I started asking these questions. They didn't come together in quite the form that you hold in your hand until more recently, but that's really the roots of it.
Yeah, and I remember actually one of the first things of yours that I read was that wolf reintroduction story, and just talking about this one particular wolf. I guess that's a perennial thing that comes up in this region, and I've found that I think like the Northwest in particular is such a prime area that these questions come up all the time. But yeah, so like one question that comes up repeatedly in the book is also what we owe to nature. And, how much should we be actively managing things versus kind of just letting nature take its course, and morally, is that okay or not? And one thing that came up actually like a couple of days ago, during this awful heat wave we've been having, was I saw someone on Twitter, I think, was just saying, should I put out water for wildlife? Like on the one hand, it seems like it's so hot, like they're not used to this. And I think there's also some level of just like guilt that anthropogenic climate change has probably contributed, or has definitely contributed to this heat wave. Like maybe we should put a little bit of water out and hope that helps an animal. But on the other hand, is that in the long term going to train them to expect that kind of water? Anyway, I guess I'm curious, how would you think about this?
Yeah, it's a great question and so timely, right? So these exact questions got me wondering about this intuition that many of us have, and this sort of rule that many of us grew up with about not interfering with wildlife. Now, obviously, in some cases, this makes total sense, right? Like if you see a bison in the middle of the road, don't interfere with it. Like give it some room. And certainly, if you're feeding donuts to wild bears or something like that, like, that that's going to cause a bad situation. But the blanket rule of never interfering with wild animals, I think really does philosophically come from this idea that humans are not part of nature. And the only way we can do right by nature is to withdraw from it and to stay away from it and to take ourselves out of it. I think this is a fundamentally incorrect assumption. I think that humans have always been part of nature. We're an animal, and our influence on ecosystems goes back thousands of years, not just more recently, although it has definitely ramped up more recently. And so all of these other species, these other animals that we share the planet with, they have been living in a humanized world by and large for at least centuries. And certainly with climate change and the heat waves that come with that, those are direct human effects. So the idea that giving water to a hot animal would somehow be breaking a barrier seems nonsensical when that barrier was broken a long time ago. That horse is so far out of the barn, you can't even see it anymore. So I don't think there's anything wrong with giving water to wildlife during a heat wave. Now, should we be trying to do it on a massive scale? Should there be government employees trying to hand out water to wildlife? These are complicated questions. But I have a skunk that lives under my back porch, and she has 3 babies right now, and I put water out for her, and I did not feel a bit guilty about it. So there's your answer, practical answer for you.
The babies need water.
That's right.
Well, so that gets me to thinking about something else that came up a lot for me as I was reading your book, which is just how much, fundamentally we're humans, and humans are often trying to manage these situations, but just how much our human emotions and feelings about things sometimes get in the way or bias how we approach things. I get the sense that in a lot of cases, what we're doing or what we're not doing is because we feel bad, or
that's true.
we want to feel like we've done something. So at some points in your book, you get into these philosophical conversations about what has value and why, whether species have value, whether ecosystems have value, and how at the end of the day, maybe what we're doing is actually kind of for ourselves in a sense.
Right.
I wonder if you can say more about that. What doesn't matter, what motivates us to take action if we're taking action, or is no action sometimes the best thing to be doing?
Yeah, that question between action and inaction is really at the heart of this, right? Because if you have this simple rule, let nature take its course, never interfere with nature, then you don't have to worry about a lot of these conundrums. But once you realize that there isn't that primary directive of not interfering with other species, then you have to start figuring it out on a case-by-case basis, when to intervene and when not to intervene. And I spent a lot of time in the book, as you say, talking about the pros and cons of those different interventions. And a lot of times our impulse to intervene does come from an emotional place. So I think emotions can be really useful as sort of fingers pointing to, there's something going on here, maybe we should examine this, we should think through this. But I think just acting on emotion alone can lead us to weird places. For example, a lot of times people who are totally animal lovers when it comes to pets or to native wildlife will get really upset about non-native species, and they'll be willing to control or remove or kill them in ways that they would consider inhumane if they did them with a pet animal or a native species. So, and that doesn't really make any sense from the point of view of the animal, because they have no idea that they're in the wrong place. They're not intentionally trying to cause problems, and they often have the same cognitive capacities. So I think emotions point to something where we need to think harder about it, but we need to go beyond just acting on emotion and try to combine our emotion and our philosophical tools.
Definitely. Yeah. Speaking of this invasive versus non-invasive thing, this is something I wanted to ask you about too, bringing it back to the part of the world that we're in. And I know, you are from Seattle, and you've probably heard that news story that has been all over the place for the last few years, every summer, about the goats being airlifted from the Olympic Peninsula to the Cascades. And every time I've seen those stories, I've been so intrigued. Well, one, because of the extremely photogenic airlifting of the, it's like a goat dangling from a helicopter, being flown away. But also I was doing some research about this and discovered that the Olympics got goats because people brought them to the Olympics. But now we've decided it's too much. And it's just kind of a strange situation because I feel like, as you said, these goats don't know that they're non-native. They don't know that a lot of people are thinking of them as intruders and, disturbing their wonderful hikes. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm curious if you've been following that story at all and if you've been thinking about that in the framework of your book.
Yeah, I mean, my take on non-native species is always that we shouldn't base our decisions about what to do about them on the fact that they're non-native, right? Like that should never be the reason that we take some sort of action. So some non-native species cause really clear problems, especially on islands or in Australia. You can see non-native predators are a real big threat to the native animals. So in those cases, yeah, you want to sit down, you want to try to figure out how to manage that problem, and it might involve killing them. And I talk a lot in the second half of the book about that. But if you're only removing them because they're non-native, then I think that is, I don't think that's as defensible ethically. First of all, it's suggesting that there was this one frozen moment in time when everyone got a passport about where their native range was, and that every species has to stay in that exact native range forever and ever. And then the moment that we chose for when everybody's range should be is always the moment before colonization, which is a clue that this isn't really a scientific thing that's happening. This is a cultural thing or an emotional thing, a social thing. So my sort of prescription with non-natives is always look at the place where they are, look at what your goals are for that place, look at whether they're helping with those goals or hindering those goals or neutral. And if they're neutral or even helpful in some cases, then I don't think it's worth spending the time and money to remove them on the basis of purity. I honestly think that anytime anyone starts appealing to some kind of purity-based value, we're in bad territory. I think that's where we start to really go astray when we're saying, oh no, this needs to be this way because it's always this way, or this is how it looked in 1850 or whatever. Like those are, I don't think that kind of purity stuff works with ecology, with nature, because nature is always changing and always has been changing. So it's a bad fit for it. I talk a lot about non-native species in the book. In some cases, I talk about them. I talk about being like pretty willing to take action to remove them from a place, even though it kind of breaks my heart. And in other places, I think it's pointless. So it's very case by case.
Definitely, yeah. And I guess speaking of case by case situations, I feel like another kind of push and pull in the book is talking about cases where it seems like two species' livelihoods are somehow diametrically opposed. Like in order for one to survive, another must be culled. And it feels like in a lot of cases, for whatever reason, the thing that must be culled are rats.
Yes.
Rats just seem to be universally like, we want fewer of them. But one thing that you asked at the end of that chapter, which really resonated with me, I'm just going to read it, is, does it matter if it's genetically unique or not? Does it matter whether it'll be able to survive on its own after the killing, or if it'll be conservation reliant forever? Doesn't matter if it sings in a minor key. Doesn't matter if it's beautiful. And this really just got me thinking on, where do we draw the line on which animals to save and which to kill? And what trends do you see in the decisions we tend to make about that?
Yeah, I mean, I believe that biodiversity is valuable. I struggle a lot with how to sort of prove that in the book, but deep in my heart, I really think that when we drive something extinct, it's a bad thing. I'm not pro extinction in any way. But having said that, there are some cases where the price of keeping a certain, lineage of animals around is really high in terms of the suffering of other animals. And so then you want to start asking, like, how distinct is this? Like, let's say you have, as there is a lot of cases where albatrosses are threatened by rats on these little islands because they're used to just having these islands all to themselves. They have their eggs on the ground. They have no behavioral setup to deal with predators going after their eggs or their chicks. And so mice and rats can just go to town and it's an egg buffet. So, I think that it's worth trying to keep those albatrosses around. There's one case in particular where there's this species called the Tristan albatross, and it really only is on one island, and that island is crawling with rodents. And so I was like, okay, this seems like a clear case. Like, we have this population modeling. It shows that if we don't get rid of these rodents, that this albatross, the Tristan albatross, will go extinct within 100 years. It seems like if there's ever a really clear case when it's worth it, when it's ethically okay to kill, this would be it. But then I read this other paper that said the Tristan albatross was so close to the wandering albatross genetically that you can't even tell them apart visually, and they're really close genetically, and that some people think they're the same species. And there's a ton of, well, not a ton, albatrosses, there's not a ton of any albatross, but there's way more wandering albatrosses. So then I was like, oh, my mind is blown. Like maybe it isn't distinct enough to warrant all that killing for us to do. And I honestly, I still think we should probably try to save it, but it's not a slam dunk for me. And I think these cases are just confusing.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, well, do we know whether, they would have just naturally mated and then, like, if humans didn't exist at all, right? It's like, well, then how would we feel about that, right? Like, why wouldn't we just let nature take its course in that way?
Yeah, and if you talk to Ariane Wallach, who's one of the compassionate conservationists that I interview in the book, she would probably say that the mice are on this island now, they have their own wild existence, and the thing to do is not intervene. I don't totally agree with Ariane there, but I can see her argument. Because here's the thing, I do also talk in the book about something, I don't think that wildness or naturalness in the sense of being separate from humans is something that we should obsess about or focus on, because I think it's a red herring and also incorrect. But I do think that wildness in the sense of the individual autonomy of individual animals is kind of valuable, right? Like I have this whole chapter about zoos, and part of the reason I don't like zoos is because those animals are stuck in there and they can't be free and they can't make their own choices. So when we're intervening, we're often taking away that autonomy of either the animals we're trying to save, in some cases, like in a captive breeding situation, or the animals we're trying to kill, like the rats or the mice on an albatross island. And so balancing the autonomy of these individual animals with the goal of biodiversity, that's a tough one. And I think getting that purity stuff out of the way makes a lot of these cases easier, but there are some cases that are still really difficult.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about the zoo thing. For those who haven't already read it, Emma also has a great op-ed in the New York Times recently, basically arguing that maybe we shouldn't have zoos anymore. And I'm wondering if you can just walk us through that a little bit. I know also your journey with zoos started at the Woodland Park Zoo, so bringing it back to the local angle there. Tell us about zoos.
So I grew up in Wallingford, close enough to the Woodland Park Zoo that I could hear the siamangs from my backyard. If the wind was going the right direction, I could hear them. I remember that very clearly from childhood. And we went there all the time. And I have many memories of it, there with my grandmother. I researched zoos for this book because I thought, well, let's think about all the different ways we interact with wild animals. And many of them are through this conservation interactions, but zoos is another way. And the more I researched them, the more I began to discover that a lot of the animals that people love to see most in zoos are the animals that are the least happy being there, right? Elephants, great apes, big cats, polar bears, the big charismatic animals just don't actually do that well. I found tons and tons of research about these repetitive behaviors they show. They pace, they rock, they pull out their hair, they eat their own feces. I mean, it can be really heartbreaking stuff. And then I read a bunch of accounts of zoo animals attempting to escape, right? Like, so you might argue that, well, maybe they're happy in the zoos, but when they're actively trying to get out, especially great apes that have that kind of cognitive complexity, or elephants that are also really smart, you start to think they're trying to tell us something here. There were some great apes that would repeatedly escape from different zoos across the country. I tell the story of an orangutan that used to keep a little piece of wire hidden in its mouth so it could pick a lock when the zookeeper wasn't looking. So the more I read this stuff, and I thought, okay, this doesn't seem like the best place for these animals to be, but maybe it's justifiable because of the conservation, because of the good that these institutions do. Maybe zoos just create generations of people that care about animals deeply and are conservation focused. I mean, that's the argument that zoos themselves make now. Zoos are very much talking about their animals as ambassadors for their wild kin. So I looked into the research on that, and I just was not blown away. I called the AZA. I said, give me your best research. Give me the stuff that really shows that zoos will turn people into conservationists. And it was not that convincing. I mean, there was one study where they followed people around and all day at 7 different zoos all over the country and recorded everything that people said. And they never, in all of their recording, recorded a single person saying anything about wanting to save any of the animals that they were seeing. They found that only 27% of zoogoers even read the signs. So I just don't think that it's justifiable on this notion, on this ambassador argument, honestly. So in the piece, I talk about how we could maybe transform zoos to a less ethically problematic model. I want to just add that I don't think that zookeepers are bad people at all. You know, I think that they're seeing, first of all, I know that they're passionate about the animals that they work with and the individual animals they work with. They have these really strong relationships, and they're just seeing it through a framework that they've been trained in and they've been living in, they've been working in. So they're not necessarily, you know, doing this kind of research that I'm doing. I think they're great. I'd love to see them working on a slightly different framework.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I feel like that chapter on zoos in Wild Souls got at this question that I had recently. I was at the Cincinnati Zoo with a couple of friends, and we were at the gorilla exhibit, and the gorillas looked lethargic, you know, just kind of, you can see on their faces that they're kind of like, well, nothing really going on here. Right. And as we left the exhibit, we were like, do you think anyone actually comes to a zoo and then is like, we should save the gorillas in the wild? Like, does that connect for people? And so I was pleased that you get into that in that chapter. I mean, so I guess while we're talking about, you know, the future of zoos, I was also just thinking about kind of the future of conservation and specifically the role of tech. Because you talk a little bit about this in the book in a couple of ways. So on the one hand, there's like this possibility of something like CRISPR to potentially help animals adapt if they are having trouble in the wild. But then there are also things like drones that can just kill invasive species in huge numbers in a way where it seems like the draw for that in particular is that humans don't have to do it, both in terms of spending their time, but also the moral injury of just knowing that you've killed like a bajillion rats. I guess I'm curious how you think about the role of tech as we move forward in all of this.
So what I think that all of these technological advancements that are happening, in particular the genetic engineering stuff, right? So CRISPR is making genetic engineering just so much more affordable. Before CRISPR, conservationists never even thought about the applications of genetic engineering because they're so broke all the time that they could never afford it. And now it's something they could actually potentially use. I think what tech does is it gives us this, we're in this moment now where we need to figure out what we're doing ethically, right? Because we're about to get more powerful. So we need to figure out what these values are. Why, you know, what are we actually trying to save in nature? Is it wildness? Is it biodiversity? Is it the flourishing of these individual animals? We need to like get our ducks in a row philosophically before we get all the drones and the genetic engineering technologies and everything, because they're going to give us a lot of power. And if we don't know why we're doing what we're doing, we can make some very large mistakes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I guess I'm curious, in your experience talking to scientists, you also definitely reviewed a lot of philosophy. I guess I'm curious how much you see those two fields coming together. Like, are most biologists or ecologists or conservationists thinking about the philosophy, or are they versed in that philosophy?
So not, you know, this may be changing. It'd be interesting to talk to some younger people entering the field. Older conservationists by and large don't have a lot of philosophical training. That wasn't part of their training. And often I feel like those two fields haven't done a great job in talking to each other. The philosophers would publish in their philosophy journals and the conservationists would publish in their conservation journals, and they'd each have their own separate conferences. So actually I've written about 5 peer-reviewed papers now with my husband. And we've tried to publish those in conservation journals more. So we've done a few in philosophy journals as well, but so that the conservationists who have the CRISPR and the herbicide and the drones and the grants from, and, you know, and like the powers from the federal government can start thinking about these questions. So we've been trying to bring it to them across that you know, academic divide. But I think it is certainly the case that if you want to do a big, enormous grant now, you have to have a little soupçon of humanities in there. So maybe there's been a slight improvement in that over the last couple of decades.
No, that's good to hear. I mean, as though scientists don't have enough to do already, it's often hard to, try and delve into a completely new field I'm sure these are questions that come up all the time, but actually, going over the formal papers that have delved into that, like bioethics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, that's part of the reason I wrote this book, right? So I know a lot of Rambunctious Garden, my previous book, is taught a lot in conservation, grad programs or even undergrad. And so I'm hoping maybe something similar might happen with Wild Souls. And so these conservationists and ecologists who honestly, like, they want to be outside looking at birds, they want to be doing their R statistics, and they don't want to have to read philosophy papers in the raw. So I'm bringing philosophy to them in this palatable, fun way, so they can think about these things and squeeze it into their very busy lives.
Absolutely, yeah. So, one other thing I wanted to ask you about is what it was like to actually just be in the field. And if you can talk about that a little. Like, I feel like you have to go all of these amazing places in your travels in the book. And in particular, I wanted to hear more about this encounter that you describe in the book. You kind of, you were very chill about it in the book, is how I'll put it. You mentioned just kind of casually that you had a close encounter with a jaguar, and you were like, "Oh, I'm just skin and bones," essentially. But then you seemed very zen about that in a way that I do not feel like I would be zen. But I just want to hear you talk more about that experience.
I'm wondering if the reason I was like trying to play it cool is because I've been hanging out with these National Geographic photographers, and they all have stories that would like literally curl your hair. So it's like, I don't want to act like I'm, so I've seen one jaguar, and I didn't even see it. So what made it actually kind of scary is I was this was in the Peruvian Amazon, and I was out with a group of Machiganga hunters. They're the people who live inside the Manu National Park, which is possibly the most biodiverse park on earth. So it was a really amazing place to be. And they live right in the middle of the park in these villages, and they hunt monkeys. So I was monkey hunting with them. They use bow and arrow, and it's really, you have to cover a lot of ground. You're going out all day. It was extremely taxing physically. And it's like very hot. There's vines everywhere. I was falling all over the place. I was still a wreck. They were very sweet to put up with me. But anyhow, we're on this hunt, and all of a sudden, all of the people I'm with, all the Machiganga and my translator, all freeze and get this look on their faces. And I'm like, what's going on? And it's the monkeys are making the alarm call for jaguar. And so everybody knows there's a jaguar around, but it's a very dense jungle, and you can't see 2 feet away. So nobody knows exactly where it is, where it's pointing, what it's looking at. And it was this really amazing moment where I realized that for the first time in my life, and hopefully for the last time in my life, I was afraid that another animal was going to eat me. Now, jaguar don't usually go after adults. They will go. They have more problems with jaguars eating their chickens and their dogs, and occasionally a small child. But like a mountain lion or something, they're not tending to go. They're a little bigger than mountain lions, but they don't tend to go after adult humans. But I was still scared, and the people I was with were still paying attention, good attention, close attention to what was going on. So yeah, it was an intense moment. And then Elias, the guy, sort of father of the family, took off after him. Well, first he dosed himself with a little jungle medicine, a little traditional medicine to get his attention focused, laser focused. And then he took off after the jaguar, because they don't want jaguar to be that close to the village, because they'll eat their dogs and their chickens. And then we were all just waiting the result, which turned out to be sort of anticlimactic. We didn't see the jaguar didn't see him. We didn't get any monkeys. It was kind of everybody was skunked by the end of the day, and it poured rain on us, and we were soaked to the skin, and it was one of those days. It was like the thing that we all got out of that day was like good stories, not anything tangible, but it was an interesting moment.
Truly the currency of a journalist is, well, it was horrifying, but at least it was a good story.
I know. When I went to this island in New Zealand for the book, and I was supposed to eat rats. I was supposed to eat this kind of Pacific rat, and we didn't catch any. And I was like so mad that I wasn't able to eat rats for this book. So I apologize to all of the readers of Wild Souls that I wasn't able to tell you what rats taste like. I'll try better next time.
I mean, this is maybe a little far afield, but do different rats taste different? Is this something that has come up?
They've got to. Okay, so in Seattle, there's 2 kinds of rats. You've got your roof rats, which you see on the power lines and up on the roofs, and they're littler and darker. And then you have Norway rats, which are long and big and gray, and they're more in the sewers and underground. And so they got to eat different stuff. I would definitely eat a roof rat over a Norway rat if I had to choose, because I feel like they're eating less gross things. They're less likely to be eating stuff out of the sewer.
Good to know if I ever have to choose between which type of Seattle rat to eat. Noted. I guess the other thing I wanted to ask is what didn't make it into the book? I feel like the process of writing a book is, long and onerous, and I know you've been thinking about these things and gathering string for it for years.
Yeah.
What if there had been a 16th chapter? What might it have been about?
Well, there were so many other interesting case studies that I wasn't able to include because they were sort of similar tensions. So like one that I would love to get into that's close to all of us is the barred owl versus spotted owl. I mentioned it pretty much in passing, but basically the spotted owl that we all know and love that had caused so much consternation over the 1990s and led to the Northwest Forest Plan is now being threatened by incoming barred owls, which are kind of like a cousin that were used to be on the East Coast, but they figured out how to get over the West Coast. And now they're taking their habitat, taking their nesting sites, but also breeding with them and creating hybrid owls that they call sparred owls. And so the Fish and Wildlife has been doing a pilot program of just shooting the barred owls to save the spotted owls. And in some ways that's wacky, right? Like if you define a species as they can breed and have fertile offspring, then they're basically the same species. They're just like slightly different, subspecies. And one of them is going to be put on a pedestal and loved, and the other one is just going to get gatted. It just doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem, I don't know. It seems slightly absurd. And, when you get into one of those things where it seems slightly absurd, you're in interesting philosophical territory. So I would have enjoyed doing that story in particular because it is a Northwest story. And I have tons of other case studies from all over the world that are like this. And I just kind of picked the ones that I'd seen in person or that I thought the readers would be most interested in. But the world is filled with weird conflicts between different species. There's enough to fill a whole second book.
Well, then we will look forward to that second book. I guess going back to the sparred owls, that's another thing that I feel like you touched on in this book that I had been wondering about, and actually I've heard from a few biologists, this concept of what is a species and how I think as a kid, or even really honestly up until I was probably like 30, I was just like, a species is a species. It's like they're all different from each other. If it's a different species, it's a different thing. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about kind of where this concept actually comes from.
Yeah, so the scientists call it the species problem. Because there are a bunch of dueling definitions of species. So the one that most of us, I think, grew up with is this thing, if they two individuals can breed together and their offspring is fertile, that's like the Ernst Mayr biological species concept. But there's actually tons of other ones out there. So a lot of people now just do it based on genetic similarity. So they'll just run the DNA of the two individuals through, they'll make these family trees, and then they'll just kind of make circles around the end of each branch and say, these guys are all part of the same species. And there's others who still think that the sort of morphological, like the way the animal looks and the way it behaves should be really important. And then with something like the Florida panther, I mean, part of the reason why the Florida panther was declared a separate species is because it was geographically separated from the other panthers. That was part of the reason that it was considered its own species. It was also the thing that threatened it with extinction. So in order to save it, they brought over Texas panthers to give it a little bit of a dose of additional genes, right? So the problem with there not being a really ironclad definition of species is that it's not that big of a deal if you're just wondering at the diversity of life and you're having like, a tea party between the lumpers and the splitters, and you're disputing over whether these should be 5 butterfly species or 2 butterfly species. But when you start killing to save particular subspecies or populations, or if you start using massive amounts of resources because you say this is distinct from this or this is the same as this, then you get into weird situations, and what your definition of species can have life or death consequences. So it's interesting.
That was another thing that struck me about this book, which I did not know before, is just kind of the economics of some of these programs. Just how much countries are spending on some of these programs and what they could be spending that on instead if they opted for a different but possibly equally effective strategy. I guess I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about like how much money we spend on this stuff all the time.
Yeah, I mean, conservation is an industry now, right? So there's people that, for example, there's a lot of laws that say that if you build a big box store over here, but where there's a wetland, you have to restore the wetland over here, and then you hire a company to do that, and that's a whole industry. But these projects where you, for example, get all the rats off of an island, they're expensive as all get out. You have to do a huge amount of advanced plan. The bigger the island and the more humans and other, valuable species that are on there, the more expensive it is. You have to get everything that you don't want to die off the island or protect them somehow. And then you got to get these helicopters, you got to buy all the bait. So in one of the chapters, I go to the Galapagos and I look at a rat eradication project there. It's been like 5 years in the making. It's going to cost, I forget what the exact figure is, but millions of dollars, so much money, in fact, that I recently, after the book came out, I got a press release saying that Leonardo DiCaprio is now going to be funding part of it. So in order to get that to happen that's the level of philanthropy that they're having to tap into. So yeah, this is big money. Yeah, he's very interested in the environment. And I'm actually kind of impressed that he found Island Conservation, which is the group that's doing it. They're kind of a niche conservation group. So anyway, yeah, big money and big ethical consequences to some of these actions. And that's why I think we need to figure out, what we're trying to accomplish, and why. So if the sparred owls do pretty well in the Pacific Northwest forest, and they're able to live not only in the old growth, but also in the second growth, and they contain genes from both the spotted owl and the barred owl, maybe is it possible that is actually nature figuring out how to deal with all the human bullshit that we put on the planet, and that's actually the solution and not the problem? So, I speculate about that at some length in the book, that in some cases when we're tempted to intervene to put things back the way they used to be, and maybe that we're actually thwarting the actual solutions that are right in front of our noses. We just don't like them because they involve change.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, what do you think are the chances that we're going to have a coherent goal or strategy? I'm thinking about, the Endangered Species Act and how, decades ago that seemed like it would have never happened. And it all came together through a lot of really focused, organized work where there's a lot of collaborative conversation around what are our goals and how are we going to accomplish them. And I guess I'm curious, do you ever see that happening with kind of these thornier or equally thorny ethical questions?
Yeah, I'm optimistic, honestly. I feel like we're actually at a good moment. I say, looking at the wildfire smoke outside my window, I think, but for example, the Biden administration has talked about this 30% by 2030 plan of more protected areas, so, and that's the first time in a while, I think, that we've seen these sort of bigger scale conservation projects being batted about, rather than just focusing on climate change, which is also, of course, massively important. But I also, I think we're in a moment where some of this stuff might be more possible. And so let's say that there is a push to do 30% by 2030. Well, maybe there should be a philosopher on that planning commission, and that they can help with some of these priority setting and some of these other some of these other ways that we as a society act upon the landscape, right? So we all do in our private property. We kind of write the landscape through our collective, through the city of Seattle, through King County, through the United States of America. And at all of those levels, there's nothing stopping you from, taking a second to sort of figure out what your values are and what the values of the people who you represent are, and talking to the people who care and trying to get your head screwed on properly before you actually start doing stuff or not doing stuff.
Or not doing stuff. Yeah, definitely. So something you said earlier made me think, so, of course, it takes forever for a book to go through the full process and get printed and become a physical item.
Right.
What else has happened in the time since you hit a hard stop on the book?
Yeah.
That you wish might have gotten into it, or just anything related that's happened in the last little bit?
Yeah, no, definitely the Leonardo DiCaprio getting on board with the Flourishing project. I was like, damn, I could have interviewed Leo. but also, I mean, other stuff too. Just was it today or yesterday? A Nature paper came out showing that there's a team that's gotten gene drives to work in plants, which opens up a whole new set of possible ways that we could, there are a lot of trees that we love, that people love, that are dying of introduced tree diseases. Could we use gene drives to save all of the white bark pine across the entire West? And if so, would we want it, would people rather have GMO'd white bark pine that just have one little resistance gene sewn in there and are otherwise exactly the same? Or would they rather have dead white bark pine? I mean, that's probably not the only two options, but I'm very curious what society would say about that particular question. So yeah, new stuff all the time.
One thing that you kind of push up against, but kind of explicitly decide in your book not to get into, it sounds like, is this question of plants. And I guess I'm curious, what do we owe to plants versus kind of more charismatic fauna?
Yes, I'll answer this and then maybe we should go to questions. But I almost think this might have to be the next book, honestly, because it's so fascinating, right? So I don't know. Oh, I think it's underneath my computer, but the new Suzanne Simard book she's the researcher up in British Columbia who's so famous for figuring out that all the trees are talking to each other and through fungal partners underground in this huge multi-species network, and they're sharing carbon and they're sharing information and those kinds of findings, especially in the fungal world, honestly, that fungal biology is so fascinating. I think they really are going to challenge our, ideas a lot. In this book, I talk a lot about individuals versus species, like how do we balance that? But it's beginning to look that plants and fungus are not either individuals or populations. They're some sort of hybrid of both. They're both a collective and individuals in some ways. And they're smart, they're making decisions. They're deciding to produce anti-bug chemicals when their neighbor starts getting eaten by bugs. They are reaching towards the sunlight. They are preferentially giving resources to their own offspring over other trees. That's why she called the book The Mother Tree, because they are literally mothering their own children. The more we learn about these plants and their inner lives, I think the more complicated our ethical relationships with them are going to be, for sure.
Definitely, yeah, and just stretching how we think about our duty to the living world.
Yeah.
All right, well, maybe that's a good place to stop and take some questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I do have a couple here. So the first one is, do you find more children, he gives the age of 8 to 12, becoming more aware of and in support of animal welfare or awareness issues? He's making the observation that he's seen more of that, more of their presence for those issues online.
That's interesting. I don't know if you've seen that, Jane. My own children are 9 and 11, and they're not a good sample because I talk about this stuff at the dinner table with them all the time. So they've been tainted with these weird ideas. I don't know, Jane, do you know much about child animal activism?
I don't. I have just generally been struck by how much more conscious a lot of kids are of the natural world and kind of our duty to it. Maybe that's just, as I mentioned, I was not an outdoorsy kid at all. So maybe that's just in comparison to what I was like as a kid. But
no, I think that's definitely true. I mean, certainly you see this whole generation of climate leaders coming out of sort of Generation Z. And I wouldn't be surprised if there was also sort of an animal welfare, animal rights group in that age group as well.
What are gene drives? Can you?
Oh, yes, sorry. Yes, you live in your nerdy bubble and then you forget to define your terms. So gene drives are, and this is going to be a good challenge for me because they're tricky. So if you genetically modify an organism, you might add a gene, say, maybe you have a mouse that's usually brown and you add a gene and now it's white. But when that mouse grows up and has babies, then half of them, and let's say it's part, it mates with a brown mouse. So then if it's strictly Mendelian, you'd have half of their babies would be brown and half their babies would be white. What a gene drive does is that it puts not just the gene for having a white coat in there, but it also puts the instructions for putting in the gene to have a white coat in there. So that when that mouse reproduces, that same genetic manipulation occurs in every single one of its reproductive cells. So when it has babies, 100% of its babies will have a white coat. So it ensures that the genetic manipulation that you made will be represented in 100% of the offspring of that individual. So in theory, a perfect gene drive, you could release just a few individuals into a wild population. And as they bred with the other wild animals, that gene would eventually, over time, come to dominate. It would go to 100. It might take longer if it was a bigger population, but there would be no way around it. It would go into every member of that population. So that's its power, but of course, that's also its peril. There are ways to make gene drives that are limited in sort of the number of generations that they act on. So if you wanted to, for example, use gene drives to push infertility genes through a bunch of rats on an island, if you figured out exactly how many rats were on the island and you figured out how many generations it would take to get to all of them, and then you put in something into the gene so that you can actually add instructions for it to stop working after 7 generations, say. So then you wouldn't kill every rat on the entire planet of Earth, which would probably be a bad thing. I mean, I'm sure there's people out there who'd be fine with that, but I wouldn't be one of them. I think rats are lovely. So, but you could potentially use something like that to eradicate rats from an island without ever having to actually kill any of them, because those infertility genes would spread and they would just stop having children. They would just stop having babies, and then eventually the population would disappear. So in theory, it's a way out of some of these ethical tensions between individuals and species, but it's also extremely terrifying because if we aren't careful with how we deploy it, it's just a really powerful tool.
Yeah, I guess I'll add that in addition to the rat example, the one that I've heard that I feel like people have very strong pro feelings about is the exact same thing, but mosquitoes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing to me how quickly people are like, well, I don't know, rats, I don't like them, but I want all of them to die. But then when it comes to mosquitoes, everyone's like, yes, we're
Yes.
done. We don't want them around. And I think that also gets at some interesting things that you talk about in the book with just, how do we decide what is worthwhile?
Right.
But
yeah, with the mosquito example, right? So the mosquitoes are giving people malaria and killing their babies. So it seems like the ethics there seem much different. And even E.O. Wilson, the Mr. Biodiversity himself, has said that he would be happy to completely drive extinct a couple of key mosquito species that transmit malaria, which I thought was really interesting. So, I think that there are some animals that cause, so much human suffering that the kind of general rule that extinctions are bad might even not apply in some of those cases. But that's another interesting question.
As a person who seems to really attract mosquitoes, I would not mind if they were all gone. Let's see. There's another question here about sort of the next generation. So what may matter the most is how those who are in grade school today will carry forward habitat restoration. What should parents and educators be doing that they're not doing now?
So my thoughts on this are that well, first of all, you always got to be careful you don't push it too hard. And this is something I struggle with my own kids, right? Like if I'm a little too, yay, nature, I think that then you can see them suddenly want to play Mario Kart. So you got to balance that. But I also think it's really important that kids learn to love nature as it is around them, to love the species that are close to them, to get to know their names, to have a relationship with them. Because I think that if kids only have a relationship with the kind of the high value, high gloss, pretty nature like Yellowstone or Yosemite that's far away and that they might only get to visit once or twice in their whole childhood or not at all, they're not going to forge that connection. So when I talk to practicing conservationists who do it for a living and I ask them about what formed their connection to the natural world, 9 times out of 10, there is a fort involved in the story. And it's usually like out behind the back of the suburban cul-de-sac and, the drainage ditch. And, these are not pristine, quote unquote, ecosystems by any stretch of the imagination. And many of them, had formative experiences bird watching in Central Park. So I think it's really important that kids form a relationship with their local non-humans, even if they are mostly gray squirrels and robins and, street trees, plane trees, and sycamores. I think those are fine. Those organisms are really valuable and fascinating too.
So we just have a couple more minutes here, and I think we have just one more question. So if evolution is what got us and our planet to where we are, where is evolution taking us in the future?
Ooh, that's a really, that is a deep question to go out on.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that I talk about in the book is how humans have had such an impact on the planet that we have probably influenced the evolutionary trajectories of many wild animal species by, and a lot of this goes back really far in time. So, for example, wolves today are a little bit bigger than wolves were in the Pleistocene. And that's because they used to be bigger wolves. We killed them off. And so then the little wolves got bigger. But a lot of extinctions happened in the Pleistocene, and the entire ecosystem remodeled in the wake of that. We don't have mastodons anymore. We don't have giant ground sloths. So in some ways, those extinctions have shaped the evolution of everything from, ground squirrels to birds. So I think one thing that is probably likely is that for at least for a while, humans are going to continue to influence the evolutionary trajectories of non-humans. And I don't think we can prevent that because right now there's a strong selection pressure for heat tolerance in all of the animals that live in Washington state. The ones that couldn't handle it are dying and they're not going to reproduce. So I think that is one thing that we can probably put our money on, is that we can't stop ourselves from influencing other animals. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we should try to do it intentionally, but it does mean that it isn't something that would be brand new if we did do it intentionally. Do you have anything to add to that, Jane?
It just feels like, it's inevitable that it feels like we've evolved to a point where humans are so capable of manipulating the world that there's no going back from here. So
I think we're really in that sort of 2-year-old stage where we've learned how to stand up and wipe everything off the table. And we can really make a big physical difference in the living room, but we haven't learned how to kind of plan ahead and, do it together and kind of do it thoughtfully and do it ethically. I think that's the stuff we're still working on. The real trick is to try to make sure that our ethics and our humility keep up with our powers.
Absolutely. Yeah. A 2-year-old's moral development has just begun.
Right.
And it seems like in the world of conservation, that might also be true.
Great.
Well, thank you both so much for this talk tonight. Super interesting, and it's a really great one to go out on. I think a lot of people over the summer will be out in nature, and hopefully they'll be thinking a lot about what you've talked about tonight. I want to thank the audience for watching tonight. Thank you for your questions. Thanks for joining us this season in our virtual world. It won't be going away next season entirely, but it's been a great experiment kind of, and great to have everybody along. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of Wild Souls, I encourage you to use the link in the chat. That's going to take you right over to Elliott Bay, and you can support a local store tonight. Thank you both again so much. I hope that you both have wonderful summers. Hopefully the smoke doesn't get too bad over here. So stay safe and have a great night.
Good night. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.